I've always been a routine person. Same grocery store every Sunday evening, same cafe before work, same walking route home, even when I told myself I should switch it up. I lived alone in a small apartment building on a quiet street, the kind of place where nothing dramatic ever happened. That predictability made life feel manageable, safe, especially after long workdays when all I wanted was to move through familiar spaces without thinking too much. That's why I noticed him. The first time it was outside the grocery store. I remember because I was irritated. My headphones had died and the store was louder than usual. He stood near the bike rack, not doing anything in particular, just watching the parking lot like he was waiting for someone. Mid-30s, maybe older, clean clothes. Nothing about him screamed danger. When I passed, he smiled briefly, the polite kind of smile you give a stranger when your eyes meet by accident. I forgot about him almost immediately. A few days later, I saw him again. This time, he was across the street from my apartment building, standing under a streetlight that flickered on and off. I noticed him because I was fumbling with my keys, and that feeling of being watched crept up my spine. When I looked over, he wasn't staring. He was looking past me, like I wasn't even there. I told myself it was coincidence. Cities are full of people who pass through your life without meaning anything. But then, he started showing up everywhere. Outside the cafe I stopped at before work, sitting on a bench in the park during my lunch break, standing near the bus stop on nights I worked late. Always far enough away that I couldn't accuse him of following me, always positioned like he just happened to be there. What unsettled me wasn't how often I saw him, it was when. He appeared on days I changed my routine, when I left work early, when I stayed late, when I skipped the cafe entirely and went somewhere else. It felt like he was adjusting to me, not the other way around. I tried testing it, took a different route home one night, looping around an extra block. Halfway through, I spotted him leaning against a closed storefront, looking at his phone. When I slowed down, he slowed down. When I stopped, he stopped. The moment I turned my head, he looked away. My heart was pounding by the time I reached my building. A week later, I worked late on a Thursday. The street was nearly empty when I got home, quiet enough that every sound felt amplified. As I unlocked the front door, I heard footsteps behind me, slow, unhurried, deliberate. I turned around. It was him. He stood just outside the light, hands in his pockets, posture relaxed. Before I could speak, he said, "You don't usually work Thursdays." His voice was calm, almost friendly. My stomach dropped. I demanded to know how he knew that. He smiled faintly and shrugged. "People notice patterns," he said, then walked past me and disappeared into the darkness. After that, the feeling of being watched followed me inside. Small things started happening. My phone battery drained overnight. A cafe receipt appeared in my kitchen counter that I didn't remember bringing home. One morning, while brushing my teeth, I noticed a clean handprint on my bathroom mirror, fingers spread wide, as if someone had pressed their palm there deliberately. I checked the locks constantly. I slept lightly, waking at every sound in the hallway. The last time I saw him was near the bus stop. I'd worked myself into a quiet rage by then, fear turning into something sharper. I walked straight up to him and told him to leave me alone, to stop watching me. He looked genuinely confused. Then he frowned and said, "I stopped watching weeks ago." He leaned closer and lowered his voice. "You've been alone long enough now. I was just making sure you stayed that way." That night, I left. When I returned days later with someone else, my apartment looked untouched, but on my bedroom wall, faint and uneven like it had been traced again and again with a finger, were the words, "You changed the ending." I didn't notice anything wrong at first because my life was painfully ordinary. I worked a desk job, lived alone, and spent most evenings at home, scrolling through my phone or watching whatever autoplay served me next. I wasn't someone people paid attention to. I didn't post much online, didn't share my location, didn't overshare my personal life. That's why when strange things started happening, my first instinct wasn't fear, it was confusion. It began with emails, password reset requests I hadn't asked for, login alerts from devices I didn't recognize. At first, I assumed it was spam or a random hacking attempt. I changed my passwords, enabled two-factor authentication, and moved on. But the notifications kept coming. Not frantic, not aggressive, just persistent. Always late at night, always when I was home alone. It felt less like an attack and more like someone testing a lock they knew would eventually open. Then my streaming history changed. Shows I'd never watched appeared half-finished, paused at specific moments, like someone had stopped deliberately. Music playlists I didn't recognize were saved under my account, filled with songs that matched my taste a little too closely. Familiar artists, familiar moods. It felt personal in a way algorithms never do. I told myself it was a glitch, but deep down I knew someone else was inside my digital life, moving around quietly, careful not to leave a mess. Things escalated when I got a message from my own account. It was a simple DM sent to myself at 2:11 a.m. It read, "You should lock your door tonight." I stared at the screen, my heart pounding, trying to convince myself it was a prank or some delayed draft. When I checked the login history, the message had been sent from my phone, from my apartment, at a time when I'd been asleep. I called customer support the next day, walking them through everything. They were polite, reassuring, and ultimately useless. According to them, nothing seemed wrong. No suspicious activity, no unknown devices. Everything matched my usual behavior patterns. When I hung up, my apartment felt smaller. Every familiar object suddenly felt like it had been touched when I wasn't looking. That night, I changed my routine, turned off all devices, unplugged my router, locked every door and window. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft hum of the building settling. At 2:11 a.m., my phone screen lit up on the nightstand, despite being powered off. A single notification appeared. No sound, no vibration, just text on black. That's not where you usually sleep. I moved out the next week. I deleted accounts, changed numbers, started fresh somewhere new. For a while it worked. Then one evening, months later, I logged into a new streaming service for the first time. No history, no profile picture, just a single recommendation waiting for me. The title was unfamiliar, but the description felt wrong, too accurate, too intimate. Below it, in small gray text, it said, "Because you watched this late at night alone." I used to think routines were harmless, comforting even. I worked regular hours, stopped for coffee at the same place every morning, went to the same grocery store on Sundays, and took evening walks around my neighborhood to clear my head. It was a quiet suburban area, the kind where porch lights stayed on wait and people nodded politely but never really talked. I liked the predictability of it. It made life feel manageable. Looking back now, I realize routines don't just make life easier for you, they make you easier to follow. The first sign was so small I almost missed it. One morning, the barista at my usual coffee shop handed me my order before I said a word. I laughed and made a joke about being predictable. She smiled but hesitated, then said, "I thought you were with the guy who usually waits outside." I asked what she meant, but she was already moving on to the next customer. When I turned around, I didn't see anyone unusual, just cars, commuters, and the glass reflecting my own confused face. Over the next few weeks, things began lining up in unsettling ways. I'd feel watched during my evening walks, not in a dramatic sense, but like a pressure on my back, subtle and constant. Once, I noticed footsteps matching mine, always a few beats behind. When I stopped, they stopped. When I turned around, there was no one there. I told myself I was paranoid. Stress does that to people. So does too much silence. Then, my trash went missing. Not the whole bin, just specific bags. The ones from nights I cooked. The ones with receipts, packaging, anything that showed what I'd bought or eaten. I only noticed because the bin felt lighter than it should have been. A neighbor suggested animals, raccoons, stray dogs. It sounded reasonable until I found the bags neatly stacked behind a cluster of trees at the edge of the block, tied exactly the way I tie them. The breaking point came when I got a handwritten note. It was slipped under my front door sometime during the night. Plain paper, no envelope, no fingerprints that I could see. It said, "You should try sleeping earlier. You look more tired than usual." My stomach dropped because it wasn't wrong. I hadn't been sleeping, and worse, I hadn't told anyone. I called the police. They took a report, walked the perimeter, asked if I'd had conflicts with anyone, an ex, a coworker, a neighbor. I had nothing. No suspects, no proof. They told me to install cameras, vary my routine, and call if anything escalated. When they left, the house felt unbearably quiet, like it was holding its breath. I followed their advice, changed my schedule, drove to different stores, took different routes. For a while, the ease eased. The sense of being watched faded. I started sleeping again. That's when the final note arrived. This one taped to my car windshield in broad daylight. It read, "You're harder to follow when you panic. I preferred you calm." I sold the house within a month. New city, new job, new routines, carefully broken and rearranged. Years have passed now. I don't walk at night anymore. I don't stick to patterns. Still, sometimes, I'll catch someone glancing at me a little too long in public and my heart will race. Not because I recognize them, but because part of me wonders if they recognize me. And worse, if they're relieved I finally stopped being predictable.